Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot daf tzaditet. Today's dedication. Okay, today's daf is dedicated by Rabbanit Schwartz in honor of the successful fundraising campaign for Shirat Tamar Shul in Efrat, and with deep appreciation for the Rabbanit of the Kila, Shira Merely Mervis. Okay, we're going to get started with a braita at the beginning of our page. Today is another, I would say, fun day of kind of riddles or unique situations. Okay, so bear with us. We will go through them one by one, a lot of presentations, which will definitely help. So if you're listening, you might want to bring them up on your screen. Okay, getting started. So now we're going to go through, we're quoting a braita, and the braita is going to describe a bunch of different situations here. So, yesh, tanu Rabbanan, yesh cholitza l'imo misafek, la'achoto misafek, libito misafek. There could be situations where one could end up doing chalitza with his mother out of a doubtful situation, or his sister out of a doubt, or his daughter out of a doubt. Now, this brings us back to the first Mishna of our Masechet. If you remember, you're supposed to do yibum to your mother, your daughter, your sister, or any of those 15 women. You're exempt from yibum. In this case, the problem's going to be, because we're in the middle, if you remember, of cases of these 5 mothers who mixed up their babies. So our whole topic for a lot of today is going to be mixed up children, where we don't know who their mother is. So again, we're going to have a problem where theoretically one could do chalitza to one's mother out of a doubt. Okay, so now we're going to see how this could be. We're going to start with mother, go to sister, then go to daughter. Okay, so this basically means 2 couples that each have a child not related to each other. So Yosef and Chetzron are our main characters. Yosef's parents are Rachel and Yaakov, and Chetzron's parents are Chana and Reuven. Okay, not related to each other. What happened? These 2 women, okay, in hiding. That means basically maybe they were in some place in hiding and their kids got mixed up. And they now each have another son. So this is going to be important, obviously, for yibum purposes, because there's brothers through the father. Okay, it's not just the mothers had a child, but it's the mother and father had a child, and they got mixed up. Uba bena shel zo v'nasa imo shel zeh. Ubena shel zeh v'nasa imo shel zeh. Okay, remember, Yosef and Chetzron are not related. So Yosef and Chetzron each go, okay, Rachel and Yaakov got divorced, let's say, okay, or aren't married for whatever reason. Reuven and Chana got divorced. In the presentations, by the way, whenever this happens, we try to use divorce and not death, because death always looks like there's yibum. And here we're not talking about yibum. They're just no longer married, which enables Yosef and Chetzron to each marry the wife of the opposite, right? The mother of the opposite person. So again, Yosef and Chetzron weren't related. All these situations, different from some of the riddles we had the other day, are going to be things that could have been done through halacha. So Chetzron, so we do like an X here. Chetzron marries the mother of Yosef, and Yosef marries the mother of Chetzron, okay, which is totally, they're not related, there's no problem. But now what happens? You all know where it's going. Meitu below banim, Chetzron and Yosef both die. Now we have David and Shmuel, who are their brothers from doubt. We don't know if it's David Chetzron's brother or is he Yosef's brother. And same for Shmuel, right? Now, again, they would have to share the same father, so they have to be full brothers. We just don't know who's the brother of who. So what happens? David has to do chalitza with Yosef's wife, Chana, and with Chetzron's wife, Rachel. Now, one of them is definitely his mother. And same for Shmuel. So each one ends up having to do chalitza to his mother out of a doubt. Okay, that's what it means. It's actually interesting, and we're going to see later, the next case, we're going to have 2 different versions of how to read it, and this is going to be part of the problem. Now, there's something that's definite here, and there's something that's of doubt. They're definitely going to do chalitza to their mother out of a situation of doubt. That's the way we read this line. Each one does chalitza to his mother out of a doubtful situation, that maybe it's his mother, maybe it's not his mother, and then he's obligated in yibum. So again, he's obviously not going to do yibum because one of them is definitely his mother, but he does chalitza to basically undo the chiyuv of yibum. Okay, next case. Now this case, you can already see here in the presentation, this is printed in our Talmud version as per Rashi's second version. Okay, Rashi brings 2 options. The first option he brings, we're going to learn second, which is the version that appears in the Tosefta. This also appears in the Tosefta with a bit of a different wording. We're going to go by the wording in our Gemara first, and then I'm going to actually explain it the second way as well. Okay, even though it's confusing, it's important. And for me, in this case, I decided that I was going to read you both versions. So we're going to read this case twice. Lachotomi safek, your sister out of safek. Why? Ketzad. Imo v'isha acheret she'aldu shtei nekevot b'machaveh. So Amram and Yocheved have a son, Moshe, and they get divorced, and Amram marries Shula, and then has a son, Chetzron. Okay, this goes on, Then Shula gets divorced from Amram and marries Yosef. Okay, by the way, Amram and Yocheved here are divorced. Theoretically, they don't have to be divorced. They could stay married, and Amram could just have two wives. Okay, this is going to sound a little confusing, but I'll explain it all in a minute, what the main thing you have to get out of this is. Okay, on the other side now, we have Yaakov and Rachel, have a son, Binyamin. Then again, either they get divorced or Yaakov just takes the second wife of Leah, and they have a son, Reuven. Okay, so we now have, then Leah gets divorced. Let's just finish the case, and marries David. Now, we now have basically what you want to say is, okay, it's almost, we have, let's just go one more step and then I'll say it. Shula and Yosef, this one who's, right, the husband has nothing to do with any of the people yet, and Leah and David, who also, David has nothing to do with anybody, they both give birth to a girl, and those are the girls that get confused. That's Imo v'isha acheret she'aldu shtei nekevot b'machaveh. So the situation we have in front of us, if you didn't follow all the details, I'll stress now what's important. Chetzron and Reuven are our main characters, okay? They each have a brother through the father and a sister through the mother. They have no full siblings here who have the same father and mother. The main important thing is that half brother through the father, that's going to be important for purposes of yibum, because there's only yibum if you're half brothers through the father or full brothers through the father. And half sister from the mother. Why is this important? Because Moshe and Binyamin, who are their half brothers through their father, are not related at all to these girls. They don't share the same mother. They don't share the same father. That's the important part for our purposes, because what's going to happen is the half brother from the father is going to marry the half sister through their mother. So again, the important part is those people aren't related, and then they're going to fall to them for yibum. Okay, so let's read it. Their brothers who are not from the same mother, meaning they're half brothers through the father, are going to go ahead and they're going to marry these two girls. Okay, so now we know who, right? We know that Moshe marries Tamar and Reuven marries Devorah. Binyamin marries Devorah. What we don't know is whose sister is Tamar, Chetzron's sister, or Reuven's sister? Is Devorah Chetzron's sister or Reuven's sister? Okay, that we don't know. So when these men, Moshe and Binyamin, die, umetu below banim, what happens? Chetzron, now be careful. In the last case, remember they each had to do chalitza to both women because they weren't sure who was the one married to, right, to their brother. In this case, we're going to have, Chetzron knows exactly who he needs to do chalitza to. It's only to Tamar, his brother Moshe's wife. And Binyamin only has to do chalitza to Dvorah. So each one, so now here becomes the problem with the wording. Choletz lishtehen, they do chalitza to both. Now, what this means is not each one does chalitza to both. It's that both together do chalitza to both women, meaning each one does chalitza to their brother's wife. Nimtza, because everyone knows who the wife is. They're just not sure what her status is, right? How's she related to them? Nimtza choletz lachotomi safek. Now, here's a little bit of a problem with the language, and this is what leads to the second version. Chetzron does chalitza to, this is a mistake. Chetzron does chalitza to Tamar. I fixed this before class, but I see it didn't register yet in the presentation. Okay, so here's the mistake, but if you're looking at an updated version of the chart, you'll have it right. But anyway, Chetzron does chalitza to Tamar, and Reuven does chalitza with Devorah. Okay? Nimtza choletz lachotomi safek. Maybe Chetzron, right? Achotomi safek is not, he definitely does, right? Last time we had, he definitely does chalitza to his mother because of a case of doubt. In this case, it's he maybe does chalitza to his sister. We don't know. Maybe Tamar's his sister, maybe Devorah's his sister. So if Chetzron's doing chalitza to Tamar, he's only doing it to one of them, he's ending up possibly doing chalitza with his sister. Okay? Possibly not. So this is a little bit different than the previous. In the second version, we're going to have it that this is a different reading of the same sugya. which is Rashi brings up in his first language and based on the Tosefta's version of this. A lot of times we quote a braita, it's actually from a Tosefta. So this appears in the Tosefta, but a little bit different than it appears here. So the second version is Lachoto misafek kitzad. Okay, so far it's similar. We end up though, in this case, Amram and Yocheved have two children, Moshe and Aharon. Okay, this is going to be the big difference here. Instead of one child, there's two children. Then Amram has a child with Shula, which is Chetzron. And then they get divorced and Shula marries Yosef and is going to have this daughter that we don't know. So it's going to be the same idea that he has half brothers through the father. The only difference is he has two half brothers rather than one. And he has a half sister through his mother. Then Rachel and Yaakov have a child, a daughter. There's no sons, okay? The sons, or if there are, they're just not relevant for our purposes. So what happens in this case is, Ba'u shnei achim min ha'av, Aharon and Moshe, both Chetzron's brothers, married these two girls, Tamar and Devorah. Now, one of them is Chetzron's half-sister. One of them has no relation whatsoever. So now they both married them, Nisa'um. Okay, so Moshe marries Tamar, Aaron marries Devorah, and Metu b'lo banim, they die without children. Now you can already see the advantage of this version. Choletz l'shtehen, now Chetzron actually has to do chalitza with both women, Tamar and Devorah, and one of them is his sister for sure. Okay, so choletz nimtza choletz lachoto misafek. In this case, he does chalitza to his daughter out of a situation of doubt. Okay, because one of them is definitely his sister, one of them is not. So there you have, he has to do chalitza with both of them, even though one of them is his sister. Okay. Last case, libi tomi safek. Ketzad. Ishto v'isha acheret she'yaldu shtei nekevot b'machaveh. So in this case, we're going to have two brothers, Kalev and Otniel. Kalev marries Rachel. Then we have Reuven and Shimon are brothers, the same thing on the other side, and Reuven marries Shula. So we have two brothers through the father, and the mother, it doesn't really matter, and they're each married to a woman. Now, that relation, one of the brothers, Kalev and Reuven, each have a child with their wife that they're married, okay? And those two women, the daughters, got mixed up. So that's Ishto, his wife, and Isha Acheret, and a different woman, right? Sheyaldu shtei nekevot b'machaveh. So his wife and some other man's wife gave birth to these two girls. Ubau achehen v'nisaum. Now, Otniel marries their daughter, and Shimon marries their daughter. The problem is, maybe they married the daughter, maybe, right? In other words, they married one of these girls. Maybe it's the daughter of their brother, which is permitted. Remember, you can marry your niece according to halacha. So possibly each one married their niece. Possibly each one married someone totally unrelated. So now, obviously, you can see where this is going. So Otniel marries Tamar, Shimon marries Devorah. We know who married who, we just don't know. Right? What don't we know? Whether Tamar is Otniel's niece or whether she's Shimon's niece, and whether Devorah is Shimon's niece or maybe Otniel's niece and not related to him at all. When they die, metu b'lo banim, they die without children. Zeh choletz libito misafek, v'zeh choletz libito misafek. So again, and this is again, you can see it's according to the second explanation in Rashi. This one I'm not going to explain the second way, but there is a second way to explain it. Again, you're going to have each one doing only one chalitza here. Kalev does chalitza with Tamar. Reuven does chalitza with Devorah. Maybe it's his daughter. Maybe it's not his daughter. Okay, so then you end up with a situation. In this case, again, according to this version, it matches the first version of the way we explained the second version of Rashi, but the way we explained it first, which is you end up doing chalitza with someone that maybe is your daughter. Okay, again, this one could be explained in another way, but we're not going to go through that right now. Okay, that was our first set of cases for today. Now we're going to see another braita with more interesting cases. Tanya, Haya Rabbi Meir Omer. Rabbi Meir was known to have said, Ish v'isha. Okay, this is more like a riddle. Okay, Ish v'isha pa'amim shemolidim chamesh umot. A man and a husband and wife could theoretically, in certain situations, or not even a husband and wife, I should say, a man and a woman could theoretically give birth to 5 children of different nationalities. Okay, we're going to have to see exactly what they mean by nationalities. It's not what you would say, right? It's not like Italian, French, Spanish, you know that, but we'll see. Ketzad, Israel shelakach eved v'shivcha min hashuk v'lahem shnei banim. So we start with a maidservant and a slave, not Jewish yet, not belonging to Jewish owners. They have 2 children, so non-Jew 1, non-Jew 2. Okay. Comes a Jew and he purchases these slaves. Now, they're not yet what we call avadim knanim that have converted yet, right? Remember, they semi-convert. They're not yet that. Right now, he just buys them. At this point, their two sons are still there, right? Are still non-Jews, okay? And he purchases them. Now, the next thing that happens is nitgayer echad mehem. One of the children decides to convert. So non-Jew one turns into a convert, basically. He's a ger now, okay? Next thing that happens, hitbilan l'shem avdut. Okay, the maid servant and the slave go into the mikvah to become, right, avadim knanim, which we know already. They live in his house. They become part of his family. They have to keep certain mitzvot, right? And if they become redeemed, if they get sold out of slave or they get freed, then they become Jews. But right now they're kind of half Jews. So he puts just the maidservant and the slave, not the children. Okay, the children are out of the picture. So one's a convert, one's a non-Jew. They're going to remain that way. Nizkiku zelazeh. As maidservants and slaves can have relations with each other, and if they give birth to children, their child is a slave. So child number 3 is a slave. So you can already see where this nationality difference is going. Not exactly nationality, even though it says umot, it means status. We have one convert, one non-Jew, one slave, right? Which we mean a Canaanite slave. Next, okay, so hareaya ger v'goy ve'eved. Next, shichrer et hashivcha. He frees the maidservant. Uba aleha ha'eved. Now, she engages in relations with the slave. Now, that's forbidden because she's now Jewish and the slave is a Canaanite slave. You can't have relations, but they did anyway. Hareaya ger ve'eved umamzer. Ger, goy, eved, umamzer. Okay, they now have the convert from before, the non-Jew from before, the slave, and now they have a child who's a mamzer. Now, we're going to see in the Gemara is going to point this out, that what this braita was telling you is that when a freed maidservant, who's now a Jew, has relations with a slave, the status of that child is a mamzer. You might remember this. It's like a non-Jew having relations with a Jewish woman. And we already learned that there's a machloket. We don't hold that child's a mamzer, but this braita holds that the child is a mamzer. Shichrer shnehem, let's say he frees the slave as well. Okay, so now the slave becomes free. Now they're both Jewish. Vihisi an zelazeh. And then the Jew who had purchased these slaves, this is a good question, why he still has any ownership rights, but he basically, sounds like he does have somewhat ownership rights because he marries them off to each other. Okay, whether he has to do this or they could just decide on their own, it seems like if they want to get married. Anyway, they get married, they have a fair and square, legit Jewish marriage. So their child is obviously going to be a regular Yisrael. So now you have hareaya ger, v'goy, v'eved, umamzer, v'Yisrael. And those are the 5 nations that you could have. One couple or a man and a wife, a man and a woman could end up with 5 different statuses in their children. Okay, again, a creative case. Okay, so the Gemara says to this, my kamash balan, what are you trying to teach us by telling this? What, is it just like a fun riddle? Well, they want you to know, as I mentioned before, they want you to know that a non-Jew or a Canaanite slave who has a relationship with a non-Jewish woman and they have a child, the child's status is a mamzer. And as I told you, we don't hold this way, but that's what this braita holds by that opinion. Next one. For this, you need a little bit of background in terms of laws of ketuba. When someone writes a ketuba to someone, okay, so someone gets married, even if they don't write a ketuba, it's as if they wrote a ketuba, and there's certain money that's set aside for the woman from the beginning, which means that the man's property is liened to the ketuba. So that means if he doesn't have money to pay, you can sell his property to pay back the loan. The issue here is going to be what kind of property are you allowed to sell? Generally, we say for sure land is liened to the ketuba. The question is, what about movable property? And the question here is going to be, what about slaves? Do they fall into the category of movable property, or do they fall into the category of non-movable property like land? And that's a question that's asked a number of times in the Gemara, and there's a machloket about where do we put them? Because they're not movable on the one hand, on the other hand, they are somewhat movable, right? They're not like land, they're somewhat in between. So there's a machloket about how to treat them. So here comes, remember, slaves are property, right? Because they're owned by the Jews. So theoretically, if you own a slave and you don't pay back your loan, they could sell your slave. And that's the whole question. Can they sell your slave to pay back your ketuba? Okay, but until we get there, we're going to have to see what kind of unique case we have. Tanu Rabbanan. So another braita. So far, we've only been quoting braita today. Yesh mocher et aviv. Someone could theoretically sell his father lahagvot imo ketubata in order to get money to pay his mother's ketuba. Okay, what on earth does this mean? Ketzad. Yisrael lakach eved v'shivcha min hashuk, and this is probably why they mention this case, because it's just like the previous case, where somebody purchases, just the beginning is like it. Somebody purchases slaves, a maidservant and a slave from the shuk, right? That's how they would sell them in the shuk. Again, it's hard to imagine, right, selling slaves, but that's what they used to do. I mean, you can't imagine it. We just hard for us to, right, in our day, no one would do it. I mean, people do this, but they shouldn't be. Right, in their day, it was much more acceptable. They have a son. He frees the maidservant, and the Jew decides to marry her. Now she's a full-fledged Jew. When he marries her, what does he promise her? Okay, now this is, people promise all sorts of things when they get married to someone, either because they love them or maybe because he wants to convince her to marry him. What does he tell her? He said, whatever I own when I die, all my possessions will go to your son. Okay, I'm giving him rights to all my stuff. And now remember, the son is not Jewish. Now, when he dies, right, and she's a Jewish woman, and she has this son who's not Jewish at all, in order to get his mother's ketuba money, what can he do theoretically? He can sell his father the slave, because his father ends up being owned by him. A crazy case, right? Because the maidservant's husband died. She is already a Jew. He promised all the money to her son. Again, it's only if he promised it. It wouldn't go to the son otherwise. The son now, when the Jew has no money, when he dies, he can take the slave, who's his father, sell his father in order to get the money for the ketuba. Right? A bit of a crazy situation. Okay, next. So now the Gemara says, my kamash malam, what is this coming to teach you? Okay, let's stay here for 1 minute. What is this coming to teach you? Kula Rabbi Meir. So we're now going to have two ways of understanding this. Either Kula Rabbi Meir, the whole thing holds by Rabbi Meir, who says that avda mitaltale, he thinks that slaves are like movable possessions, not like land. But even though normally only land is leaned to alone, when it comes to ketuba, mitaltale mishtabde the ketuba. Okay, this is a bit of an intro to Masechet Ketubot, which we're going to learn soon, which is our next Masechet. And there we're going to learn that a ketuba is a very strong loan. It's much stronger than a regular loan. And therefore, even though metaltalim normally are not leaned to a loan, to the ketuba it would be v'ibaitema. Alternatively, you could say, hakamashmalan avdekimikarke dami. No, metaltalim can't be collected. If you have nothing left except for movable possessions, your wife can't demand the ketuba from your movable possessions. But avadim, slaves specifically, are treated like karka, like land, and land could be collected, and that's why this slave was able to be used to collect the ketuba. Okay, so there's a debate about how to understand what this braita is coming to teach you, and by who does it hold? Are slaves like metaltalin or are slaves like karka? This is a machloket we're going to see a lot further on. Okay, we're not going to deal with it too much in depth now. Now we're going to the Mishna. Okay, so all Tanaitic sources for today so far, except for a few small lines of Gemara explaining those sources. Okay. We have a woman, Leah. Her daughter-in-law is Yael, because Yael married her son, Reuven. Okay, and then there's Shimon, his brother. So Leah has a son, Reuven again. Reuven marries Yael. So Leah and Yael are mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. Okay? But the Vladot got mixed up. So now Leah has Leah, we're going to see Yael and Reuven have a son, Shaul. Okay, so far we know who everybody is in this picture. Leah has two sons, Reuven and Shimon. Reuven and Yael have a son, Shaul. And now they're going to each have another son. And those sons are going to get mixed up. Okay, so her children, Leah's children, the mother-in-law, gets mixed up with her daughter-in-law's children. Okay, or her son's children for all intents and purposes. Now, Higdilu ata'aravot. So David and Levi, we don't know whose brothers they are. Yeah, they married women. Nasu nashim. Okay, they married women. Levi marries Tamar. David marries Michal. Umetu b'nei akala. Umetu. Levi and David died. Now the question is, what does Shimon do and what does Shaul do? Okay, Shimon is the daughter of the older woman, the mother-in-law. And Shaul is the son of the daughter-in-law. Now, and Reuven, the son. So now, B'nei HaKala, so Reuven or Shimon, okay, in this case, we're going to have Shimon do it because Reuven's already married, so we're going to put him out of the story. But Shimon is going to go along, and what's he going to do? Also, it was Shimon's son who, well, whatever. Yeah, right. One of these is potentially Reuven's son. So Shimon, who's either the brother or the uncle of the person who died. You follow? Because they're either one generation off or they're the same generation. So he's either the brother or the uncle because it's his brother's son whose wife died. So B'nei HaKala chotzim v'lo miyabnim. Okay, I went to the wrong person. B'nei HaKala is Shaul, the younger one. Okay, the son of the daughter-in-law. Okay, meaning he's basically, what's his relationship to these two, Levi and David, the two brothers? Either it's his brother or it's his uncle. Now, now he has to do yibum, it's his uncle's wife. Now, what do we remember about uncle's wife? Uncle's wife is no way. You can't marry your father's brother's wife. And that's what this is to him, right? It's either his brother's wife, one of them is his brother's wife, and one of them is his uncle's wife. So B'nei HaKala, if it's Shaul or anyone else of this, Reuven's children, chotzim v'lo miyabnim, shu safek eshet achiv, either his brother's wife, then he'd be obligated in yibum, he could marry her, but safek eshet achiv, but maybe his uncle's wife, so he can't. So he does chalitza to both women. B'nei haskena, but the woman, the sons of the mother-in-law, now for him, it's either his brother's wife or his nephew's wife. Now his nephew's wife, remember, that's like his niece. He's allowed to marry his niece. He's allowed to marry his nephew's wife. So they can, chotzim, it says possibility number one is either they do chalitza. So Shimon does chalitza to both women. Miyabmim, or he could theoretically do yibum with both women if he wanted, or chalitza to one, yibum to the other. It doesn't really matter. Why? Because it's either his brother's wife or it's his nephew's wife, which both are permitted. Made to aksherim, what about the reverse happens, which is haksherim, which is not really ksherim. The Gemara is going to change the words, but what we mean is if Shimon, let's say they all have, so Shimon marries Dana and Shaul marries Merav, and now they each have brothers also, right? It's the same case where we have these brothers who are Safek, and right, well, so we're just going through that they have brothers who we don't know who they are. Shimon and Shaul both die. Now what happens? Levi and David have to do yibum or chalitza. But what do we say here? So libnei hazkena, okay, to the son of the older woman, the mother-in-law. So that means to Shimon's wife, who's Dana. What do? Chotzim v'lo miyabmim. Now it's going to be the flip of the other case. To Shimon's wife, they can't do yibum. Why? Because either it's their brother, either they are the brother of Shimon, in which case they'd be obligated in yibum, or they're the brother of Shaul. If they're the brother of Shaul, he's the nephew. He can't marry. Again, it's the father's brother's wife, which is a problem. Okay, so safek eshet achiv, safek eshet achiaviv, right? The brother of the wife of his father's brother. But libnei kala, to Shaul's wife Merav, echad choletz ve'echad miyabem. One can do chalitza and one can do yibum. Doesn't matter which one, right? As long as chalitza is done first, because remember, what's their relationship? Either it's the brother's wife or it's their nephew's wife. And nephew's wife is totally permitted. So therefore, one does chalitza first and one does yibum. Why does one do chalitza first? We're going to see this in the Gemara, but I'll already tell you, you have to do chalitza first, because if he's not the one who's supposed to do yibum with her, because let's say he's Shimon's brother and he's not Shaul's brother, then what's going to happen? He's going to marry Merav, which is not a legitimate marriage because she hasn't taken care of her yibum yet. So we'd have to do chalitza first and then yibum. Okay, that's that case. Next. Kohenet shenitarev lada. Okay, that's it for today for the presentation. Okay, next case. Kohenet shenitarev lada bivlad shifchata. You have a woman who's married to a kohen. She has a maidservant, and their children are living in the same house, and they get mixed up also at birth, and we don't know who's who. So now we have a child, super complicated case. Either he's a kohen, or he's an eved, because he was born to the maidservant. So hareaya elu. So now we're going to have a whole slew of laws. On the one hand, we have to be strict and treat them like maybe they're a kohen, and all the laws of kohen have to be upon them. On the other hand, we have to be strict and maybe he's not Jewish at all, right? And he's a slave. And what about monetary issues? We're going to see that when it comes to monetary issues, there's a principle in halacha, comes from Bava Metzia or all these other, mainly in Bava Metzia, but in many other places as well. Hamotzi mechavero alav hareaya. If you want to get money out of someone's hands, the burden of proof lies on you. Now, in this case, this guy's safek kohen. So he could claim all sorts of things like, I don't have to pay you certain things. We'll see in a minute, because maybe I'm a kohen and I don't owe you this. So we'll talk about what that is. But when it comes to any financial situation, he's actually going to win out because the person who's trying to get the money out of him, the burden of proof lies on them, and they can't prove that he's not a kohen. So here's a whole list of things, and we're going to see this also in cases coming up, not in today's daf either, tomorrow's daf, but similar things. First of all, they can both eat teruma because either he's a kohen or he's an eved in a kohen's house. And we remember an eved Kanani in a kohen's house is allowed to eat teruma. They collect one portion together in the granary where they give out the teruma. We're going to have to understand what this means. We don't really understand it yet. Hold off. They can't become impure to dead people because maybe he's a kohen, right? Unless it's his close relatives, obviously. Okay, they can't. Now, this is the worst part of their situation. Remember the chetzi eved, chetzi ben cholin, half servant, half not, right? He's half freed, half not, can't marry anybody. And then Beit Hillel says, and then Beit Shammai says, we have to free him because otherwise he's stuck and he can't marry. And the world was created so people would marry and have children. So similar situation here. They can't get married because if he's a kohen, he can only marry a Jewish woman. If he's a slave, he can't marry a Jewish woman. So he's stuck. Okay, so right, there's something to do. Besides he's a kohen, he can only marry certain types of women because he's a kohen. He also can't marry anybody because maybe he's a slave. If these kids got older, now what's the best solution? Free each other, right? The kohen's the owner and the slave is owned by him. So each one frees the other. If he's the owner, he's freed him. If he's not the owner, he hasn't done anything. So this way, everybody becomes free. Now, once they free him, now you're left with one is a kohen, one is a Yisrael, a regular Jew. We don't know who's who. So now what happens? They can only marry women who a kohen can marry because each one is maybe a kohen. They still can't become in contact with dead people. But if they did, because they're not for sure a kohen, here come the leniencies. Well, they don't get lashes for it because you can't prove they're a kohen, so maybe he's a slave. So we don't give lashes if it's lashes out of safek. This, by the way, is what we call hatra'at safek. In order to punish you, we have to warn you. Now, if we can't warn you definitively, then that's not considered a warning. So if we say you might be a kohen and therefore you can't do this, well, you might not be a kohen. So that's not a proper warning. So therefore, you don't get punished. You don't eat teruma because you might be Israel at this point. It's actually worse in terms of teruma. If you were a slave, you'd be able to eat teruma. But if you did eat teruma, now what's the punishment for a zar who eats teruma? Besides to get to death by the hands of God, but that's not for us to deal with. That's for God. You don't pay the extra penalty because, again, what do we say? As what I said before, hamotzi mechavero alav hareaya. If you want to make them pay, you have to prove that they're a kohen. That they're not a kohen. We don't know. Maybe they are a kohen, so they don't have to pay the money. And they can't stand on line to get money to get the teruma at the granary where they give out the teruma because maybe he's not a kohen. But if you do have teruma, let's say you have produce, you take teruma from it, you have to separate teruma because you can't eat tevel, but you don't have to give it to a kohen because again, that turns into a monetary issue. Now there's two issues here with your teruma. Number one, you're supposed to give it to a kohen. It's not supposed to be yours. On the other hand, maybe it's yours because maybe you're a kohen and you can eat it. But since we don't know, you can't eat it, but financially it's yours. So therefore, what do? Mochlim et teruma. You can sell it to a kohen. Okay, because you can't eat it yourself. But the money's fully yours because unless he can prove you're not a kohen, the money's yours. Because again, this goes into financial loss. They don't get portions of the sacrifices or anything. Nobody can bring them their firstborn animal, for example, or right anything like that. Remember, the kohanim would get things that they get the firstborn and they could sacrifice it in the temple and then eat the meat. If people brought them sacrifices to bring on their behalf, so they would get the meat of that sacrifice. So they can't do that because they might not be a kohen. So they don't get parts of the mikdash, and nobody gives them sanctified items to sacrifice because they can't go sacrifice. But let's say they have a bechor in their possession. So again, they're supposed to give it to the kohen to sacrifice. They can't sacrifice it themselves because they can't go into the temple because maybe they're Israel. On the other hand, no kohen can claim it's theirs, so they get to keep it. But what do they do with it? If you can't sacrifice it, there's nothing to do. Well, remember this law? What do you do if you wait till it gets a blemish, and then it can't be sacrificed anymore, and then you can sacrifice it, then you can, slaughter it and eat it. So therefore, since financially it's his, so you wait until it gets a mum, and then you can actually eat it. He gets all the stringencies of kohanim and all the stringencies of Israelim, which is a little bit strange for the Mishna to say because we already just went through all of them. So what is this adding? The Gemara will obviously ask this question. That we'll only get to tomorrow. So now we get to the Gemara on this very long Mishnah. Metu hakshirim. So the first thing you probably don't remember because we got involved in this kohen case, but the first case was the case about the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law. So the second part of that case was not if the sons who we didn't know who they were died, but what if the sons who we do know who they are died and they call them ksherim? So elahanach mishum diyariv lehu havalu psulim. In other words, ksherim is the ones we knew for sure, which sounds like the other ones that we don't know who they are, whose their mother is, they're called psulim, right? Disqualified ones. It's a very strange language. To which Amar Rav Papa, ema umetu avadai. Papa says, no, change the wording of this Mishnah. It shouldn't be the ones who are ksherim, who are good, right? It should be the ones who were known, vadai, that we knew exactly who they are, as opposed to the ones who we didn't know who they are. So he just changes the language. Next, it's also very easy, and we've gone over this a bunch of times. In the case where we had one does chalitza and one does yibum, so specifically, dafka michlach v'hader yibume, you have to do the one who does chalitza has to do it first, as we said before, and then yibum, ava yibume v'reish shalo, you can't do yibum first, because there's a 50-50 chance that it's not your yivama, in which case you're marrying a woman who hasn't dealt with her yibum yet. That's why one does chalitza and then the other could do yibum, because either he's fulfilling the mitzvah of yibum or he's just marrying a random woman who's not related in a way that's a problematic relationship, and therefore he can marry her. Kohenet shenitarev. Now we're going to get to this case of the kohenet, and we're going to try to explain this issue of chelek echad begorin that we didn't really understand, and get to a very, very interesting machloket. Chelek echad pshita. In other words, of course, they get one portion, which isn't exactly, Rashi has a whole problem with this question. Anyway, we'll just leave this aside, but basically they're saying, what is this coming to teach us? Ema chelek ke'echad. They get a portion like one. What does that mean? T'nam kemanda amal, en chokim teruma le'eved ele im ken rabo imo. There's an opinion that says, and our Mishna must hold by that opinion, that if you're an eved and you go to collect on the line of the teruma, you go, okay, assume there's this granary, and everybody, all the kohanim would line up to get teruma. Remember, we talked about how the woman can't go on the line because either she'll end up inside the granary alone with the man, and we don't want that situation to happen, or because maybe she'll get divorced and she won't be married to the kohen anymore, and people will remember she was on the line, and they'll maybe give her teruma another time, right? Even though she really shouldn't be getting teruma then, because she's already divorced from the kohen. So here we're going to have a similar thing, which is if you're a male eved, you can't stand on that line unless you're with your master. So what does this mean? They get chelek echad. If they want to stand on line to get teruma, they need to stand together, these two people, because one's the kohen and one's the eved, but we don't know which is which. So the eved, since everyone is maybe an eved, they can't stand alone on the line unless their master is with them. So if they go together, they're good. Why? Okay, now wouldn't you think, if I'm a kohen, I'd love to send my eved to the line. I don't want to wait on line myself. I have someone who's my slave. Great, I'll send them. According to this opinion, you can't do that. So how do we know this? Titania, as it says in the braita, Ein chokim teruma le'eved ela im ken rabo imo divrei Rabbi Yehuda. This is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Rabbi Yosi omer yachol sheyomal. Of course he can go online. Why not? He says the following: Im kohen ani tnuli b'shvil atzmi. This sapek guy, he says, listen, if I'm the kohen, give me because I'm a kohen. Im eved kohen ani tnuli b'shvil Rabbi. If I'm not a kohen, well, I'm standing here on my master's behalf. Give me teruma. And that's what we would have assumed is the obvious opinion. So what's Rabbi Yehuda coming to? Why doesn't he allow this? Because bimkomo shel Rabbi Yehuda hayu ma'alim mitruma liyuchsim. Now, this is similar to when I talked about the woman and people just assume she's married to a kohen, right? She's on the line, right? And she was getting truma all these years, and then she could just continue getting truma. Now we talk about a different problem. If people see people on the line to get truma, what do you assume about them? They must be a kohen. So when they go to get married, people will say, now, people didn't always know what was people's status. So what's a good way to know their status? Now, we wouldn't have thought of this, right? Nowadays, we'd say, oh, they do, right? They bless the kohanim, right? They do with the berkat kohanim, the duchening, and the shul. That's how we know someone's a kohen, right? Or they look on their graves, right? And people often have symbols of kahuna. One of the best ways to know was, did they wait online to get truma? And then you know, oh yeah, I saw him on the line for truma. He must be a kohen. So if he's an eved and someone says that about him, right? They're going to end up marrying slaves off to Jews thinking that they're kohanim. So it's a big problem. So they say, Rabbi Yehuda says you can't send him unless he's with his master. And then everyone will know that's the master, that's his slave. Because in his town, if you would say, I saw him on the line at the granary for teruma collection, they would say, oh, that's a good proof that he's a kohen. In Rabbi Yosi's town, they would not allow that as testimony. So since they wouldn't allow his testimony, there's no problem for the Eved to go online because we're not worried that they're going to go marry someone off and say, oh, he must be a kohen because I saw him on the line. And therefore they can do it. Okay. So you end up with this interesting machloket, which could have very practical ramifications. And we're going to see a story in a minute. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, mi'amai lo he'adati ele edut echad. There was only one time I testified about a person's status. Maybe you can see why he only did this one time. V'he'elu eved l'kihuna al pi. And they married, they basically turned someone who was a slave, a non-Jewish slave. They made him into a kohen because of my testimony, because I testified that I saw him online at the granary. They treated him like a kohen. They married him off to some woman. And whoa, I can't believe I did this. It's probably why he never testified again. Right? He was horrified by what he had done. So the Gemara doesn't like this story. They say it can't possibly be true. What you think this would actually happen? And here's their proof that it could possibly have happened. Even the animals of tzaddikim don't make mistakes. Okay, help prevent mistakes, which was, if you remember, we talked about this once before, the donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair wouldn't eat tevel. And then they figured out that the food was not knowing to take in teruma maser because the donkey wouldn't eat it, right? If a donkey's not willing to eat the food, they realized there was some problem. And then they figured out that it was tevel. So if the animals of tzaddikim can do miracles, right? And bad things won't happen because of them. They won't cause people to stumble. Obviously, Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, the tzaddikim themselves are not going to cause people to stumble, and it must not be that this happens. So then what's the story? Well, they wanted to make, they were about to marry him off. Why? Well, Rabbi Yosi. He saw him on the line in Rabbi Yosi's town. Remember, Rabbi Yosi, now here you see the problem. Different towns having different rules like this creates issues. So he saw him in the town of Rabbi Yosi. Now, in the town of Rabbi Yosi, they had slaves in line because they would never accept testimony in the town of Rabbi Yosi, for this kind of thing. But Azal va'asi ba'atre to Rabbi Yehuda, but he went and testified in the court in the town of Rabbi Yehuda. So they accept testimony of the granary. So what happened? After they interrogated him enough, they realized that he was talking about in the town of Rabbi Yosi, where slaves were on the line. And then they didn't allow it. So he testified in the court thinking he was testifying that he was a kohen, not realizing that the rules were different in the town of Rabbi Yosi, but luckily they figured it out beforehand. The Gemara's assumption is it can't be that they actually married him off. It must be they realized the problem. Okay, last thing for today, Tanu Rabbanit. If we're already talking about people who can't stand on the line, we're now going to talk about other people who can't stand on the line. Tomorrow we'll understand why. Today we're just going to be left with questions as to why these people can't be on the line to collect the teruma. There's 10 people who can't collect. Or deaf, an imbecile, and a katan, or one not of sound mind. I never know the best way to translate that word, shoteh, and a katan and a minor. Tumtum v'androginus, right? Those people with doubts about their whether they're male or female, or both. Ha'evev v'aisha, so slave, woman. Arel v'tameh, uncircumcised and impure. V'nosei isha she'ena hogenet lo, kohen who marries someone who is not allowed to marry. All these people can't, but kulam shaglim lahem lebatehem, room service. Okay, they bring it to their house, they deliver it, or Amazon delivery. Yes, you can't deliver to your house. You just can't stand on the line. The only people who don't get the truma delivered to them is the impure person, because remember, they can't eat truma, and the person who marries a woman who they're not allowed to marry. Tomorrow, we'll get into why all these people can't stand on the line. With that, we'll finish for today, and have a great day, everyone.